Moving on to Ellison and Battle Royal. Ellison's slightly later generation than Ellison is, but in some ways his biography is similar. He's born in the South in Oklahoma. If you know anything about the history of Oklahoma in this period, you may have heard of something called the Tulsa Massacre, which happens in 1922. Ellison is not from there, but undoubtedly that kind of event would have made an impression on him. And basically, this is just an act of systematic violence that was perpetrated on African American people within the city of Tulsa back in 1922, which resulted in massive death and loss by white supremacists against African Americans. So this is very much the element that Ellison is growing up in. He was a trumpeter, studied music composition in college at the Tuskegee Institute. I think that's something that's sort of important knowing for this story. What Ellison is primarily known for as a writer is a novel called Invisible Man. It was the only novel he published in his lifetime, but it is one of the great novels of American literature. Battle Royal is the first chapter of the book, though it was published prior to the book in total. The book in total came out, as I said, in 1952. Battle Royal comes out in the 1940s. One of the things I think, again, that the story that Ellison is dealing with, though in some ways very different than Hughes's poem, is it does have a similar theme. A key issue is the issue of identity. Ellison begins his story with the narrator, the speaker's discussion of himself. It goes back a long way, some 20 years. All my life I had been looking for something, and everywhere I turned, someone tried to tell me what it was. I accepted their answers too, though they were often in contradiction and self-contradictory. I was naive. I was looking for myself and asking everyone except myself questions which I, and only I, could answer. Just in case you didn't catch it here, Invisible Man is the title of Ellison's novel. But one of the things I think is most interesting about this opening passage is the degree in which Ellison is struggling in the face of what seems to be a kind of absurdist society and trying to find out who he is, right? He talks about the fact that he's looking for them himself, but asking other people who he is, and that he accepted their answers, even though they were often in contradiction and even self-contradictory. In other words, the world he's living in, he's going to realize, does not make complete or total sense. And in that regard, then trying to determine who you are in other person's eyes becomes kind of an act of just absurdist contradiction. So that's one of the things going on in the story is a young man trying to figure out who he is, but very much in the context of a very particular landscape. I think one of the things that we can see too that's important for the novel is the way in which the young man, the speaker, has to deal with an oppressive white society. If you've read this story, that's obvious to you, and the kind of torture that's inflicted on not just him, but a number of African American men through the course of the story in various ways, right? It's pretty brutal and pretty difficult to read at times. But again, not something that is outside the experience that might have been Ellison's life in a lot of ways. Also, too, there's a sort of underlying conflict of what's going on in the story where we see a lot of issues that are reflections of the kind of struggle or questions that are dealt with within the African American community in the early part of the 20th century. One of those can be sort of underlined in the contrast between two particular African American leaders in the late 1800s, early 1900s, Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, Booker T. Washington's presence sort of looms over this story, I think, in a lot of ways. The thing to note about him, I think that's relevant for us, is that he felt primarily that African Americans should struggle for their own improvement, primarily through economic means, which stresses an individual's own responsibility. The expression sometimes associated with this is pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps, right? And as your book tells you, if you looked hopefully at the questions at the end, that the Atlanta Compromise, which is a famous speech by Booker T. Washington is directly referenced in the speech that the narrator gives. And the speech is famous for, as the title kind of implies, is the notion is that it does not call for blacks to directly challenge Jim Crow or segregation or any of the legal or structural apparatus of white racism of the period. He felt that African Americans should strive to build their own businesses in ways that didn't directly contradict or challenge white political power. This is in contrast to W.E.B. Du Bois, who is not exactly concurrent with Booker T. Washington, but another important leader of the era. He argued that any kind of progress would have to require political challenge, right? Whereas Booker T. Washington is arguing for responsibility, Du Bois is arguing for equality, that segregation is an evil political system and it had to be dismantled if there would be progress at all. So the world that the speaker of the story is inhabiting is very much sort of centered on this kind of conflict that's coming through. And as I noted before, Booker T. Washington is a figure that really looms over this story in a lot of ways. We can see that in several instances here. One, what does it mean to resist, right? How can one resist in a system where so much is denied? We open with a very odd kind of explanation from the grandfather, and I think this is one thing that students sometimes have been confused over. So let me just go over it quickly. Son, after I'm gone, I want you to keep up the good fight. I never told you, but our life is a war, and I've been a traitor all my born days, a spy in an enemy's country ever since I gave back my gun in the Reconstruction. Live with your head in the lion's mouth. I want you to overcome with yeses, undermine them with grins, agree them to death and destruction. Let them swallow you till they vomit or bust wide open. What here the grandfather is talking about is he sees himself as a kind of resistance figure, but in some ways his resistance is really factually just a series of acts of capitulation in some ways. In other words, he's saying that you overcome them with yeses, undermine them with grins. And he's talking about how he dealt with the sort of white supremacist power structure here. He's speaking to white people in signs of sort of accommodation or agreement rather than challenge. And the idea is at some point these yeses all turn into a kind of defiance, even if people at the time don't realize it. There is sort of a kind of absurdist quality to this, though, that in some ways, rather than direct contradiction or challenge, which he's in some ways just denied through the violent structure of the system he's dealing with, he has to sort of invent a kind of covert system of contradiction or covert challenge to the power structure, which really amounts to him just doing what he's told. And it's interesting to note, too, that people in his family think the man is crazy, that this is something that they don't want to share or don't really want to try and deal with. But it does seem to make a profound impact on the narrator. Another thing I think is significant, we can see this sort of contradiction between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois's different ethos, is the way in which the speech sort of underscores the difference between social responsibility and social equality. And again, if you don't see the conflict or didn't quite understand what was going on there, responsibility does not make requirements of the power structure itself, right? If you tell someone to be responsible, it means they're responsible for themselves. And in that case, what the narrator is saying is that we should strive for social responsibility, people working to improve themselves, but a call for social equality would be something much different and much more challenging. And you can see that the white leaders of the community where the story takes place are very much angered and incensed by the word equality when it comes up, right? So then one of the final questions is for, I think, the narrator's identity here is what does his own striving, what does his own sense of accomplishment actually means in this system? In other words, the story is trying to characterize the boy's existence is a kind of group of bad choices that he has to deal with, right? What does his own social striving in this story mean? Is what he's doing, is the fact that he's an accomplished student, that he's been allowed to give this speech, that he's been going to go to college, all significant accomplishments of the period. What do these acts of accomplishment actually mean? Is he actually define the power structure in some sense because he is rising above it? Is it marking his subservience to it because as he rises, he is rising and past that the white power structure is in some ways deeming socially responsible for him? Is it in some ways neither, right? And what I mean by absurdity is that's kind of system where any kind of answer you give is going to not make much sense in the given context, right? So if his striving is in some ways a kind of subservience, and it seems in some case the gentlemen of the town think it is. You can note by the passage of the superintendent who speaks at the conclusion of the speech. He says, he makes a good speech and someday he'll lead his people in the proper paths. And I don't have to tell you that this is important in these days and times, right? So that the idea here is that the narrator is being kind of groomed to be a mediator and someone who will forestall social conflict. But if then to strive to succeed in those contexts is to be subservient, would it be less subservient if he did not try? What good would that do himself or anyone else, right? So once again, we're underlining this sort of sense of absurdity that occurs to whatever kind of accomplishment or whatever sense of resistance the boy can make. As the first poem kind of ends with, in some ways, I argued for a bit of a pessimistic view of the idea of social understanding. This story leaves us with lots of confusing and perplexing alternatives about how one goes about dealing with an oppressive social system that was a sort of American white supremacy back in the early part of the 20th century. How even does one define oneself against oppressive system? So as I said, I'm very interested to see what you make of these readings, as difficult as they are at some points. So I will let you take those discussions to the discussion board. And as always, if you have questions or comments you want to make directly to me, please do so.